Previously we had configured Blender for version 3.3.0. However, in the event that we wanted to reuse this configuration for another version of Blender, this is where we could either copy the folder, duplicate it, or do something called a relative link, which is pretty advanced in Windows. So I'm going to go to the app data location, and we are going to go into Blender Foundation and Blender. And like I said, if I were to copy this folder and then paste it, we have basically created a configuration for Blender 3.2. All we have to do is just rename this folder, and this folder will contain all the add-ons and preferences that we set up for 3.3, and whenever we open Blender 3.2, which was the last LTS, we see that it loads up ready to rock in the exact same configuration that we have for the other version. So that's good and all. However, let's say that we wanted to keep both of these folders congruent with each other without having to duplicate it. So I'm going to delete the 3.2 folder, and just to demonstrate how linked shell extension works, I'll have it linked in the description. I just right click this folder. In Windows 11 I have to go to show more options, and we choose pick link source. From here I'm just going to right click in a blank area of the window, show more options, choose drop as symbolic link, and now we have a symbolic link to this folder. So symbolic links have their own dangers that you must be aware of. They are a advanced sort of thing. However, I'm going to do it again. I'm just going to go to show more options, and we are going to pick our link source, and so many clicks just to do this, and we'll drop it as a symbolic link as well, and we'll just set this one up to basically represent Blender 3.1. And now I will go down to Blender 3.1.2, and we'll open it up, and we see that Blender 3.1.2 is using the exact same configuration and add-ons as Blender 3.0, and we see that it did not come across as fluidly, and that's because preferences change between Blender versions. They add options, they remove options, they change things get deprecated, but you aren't able to use preferences for very long across multiple versions of Blender. So migrating them over and over can lead to instabilities and possibly crashes. But we are able to get in and use Boxcutter, because as far as Boxcutter, the add-on goes, its API is congruent with Blender all the way back to this, and even possibly as far back as 2.83. However, that is something that can't be said about your preferences. So let us close this, and we are looking at our preferences being taken all the way back from 3.3 all the way to 3.1. I'm just going to, for the sake of this video, show more options. We will pick our link source, right click, show more options, drop as symbolic link. One day you'll see me not having that option, and we're going to just change this one to 3.0, which was a big release, Blender 3.0. And let's open up Blender 3.0, and we see a little bit of console spittle on the way in, but for the most part we are using the exact same configuration and add-ons as we used for Blender 3.3. And here we are back in Blender 3.01. We're able to enable Boxcutter, get in and begin cutting without issues. However, we see that the way that the scene starts up is a little bit different slightly, just because Blender does change in between versions. So this is just something to keep in mind, but I wanted to just show the versatility of using symbolic links when it comes to keeping the same version of your setup across multiple versions, because I see people say things like, oh, I don't want to move to this version of Blender, or I don't want to migrate over, and in my head I wonder, what is the migration process for this particular user to be talking about it like so, because really you can keep it working backwards as well as allow yourself to work forwards. And this is typically the way I work, because I'm trying to see what's happening in the future in addition to what has come up in the past. So let's just go through modifier scroll, enable an auto scroll, and just let that scroll for a moment. But just like that, we have now ran all the way back from Blender 3.3 all the way to Blender 3.0. In fact, if we want to end this video exactly on Blender 3.0, here I am popping it open, enabling Boxcutter, and I'm able to get in and work, even pause, bevel dots, and it's using the exact same configuration that I set up earlier at the very first video with everyone. This is the same configuration. Nothing has had to change with it. We didn't have to reinstall our add-ons or go through anything complicated. We're able to continue using our configuration backwards. So because we're already getting there, let's go all the way to 2.83, and I'm going to just copy this folder. This isn't actually even a good idea. I'm doing this to show what a bad idea looks like, but we're going to pick our link source, and we are going to drop this as a symbolic link, and we are going to rename this to 2.83, and now we have 2.83 as a version supported. So I'm just going to open up 2.83, and it opens up on a completely different monitor because Blender has changed in the way that it handles your startup scene and the monitor. So if I start saving my preferences at this point, things are going to start getting a little bit dicey. However, in 2.83, we're going to enable Boxcutter, and we see that it has completely decimated this top row. And this is because we can't just be reusing our preferences like this all the way through these old versions, because there's differences in the API that causes these sort of differences. This is something that you would look at and you would think, maybe this is a Boxcutter problem. Maybe it's a Blender problem. Maybe it's a my problem. But let's find out. We are going to click on File. We're going to load factory settings. By loading factory settings, we have now eliminated the possibility of it being something related to Blender. However, it could be just Blender, but we're also narrowing it down. So we see also that it's not going to let us enable this due to this already being registered as a subclass. So more than likely, in order to get this working, we are going to need to close Blender, open it up again, have it on a different monitor, but we'll bring it back. We'll load our factory settings, go into our preferences, and let's try it again. HardOps was able to enable. Boxcutter, just not able to enable. Something about the error log just isn't going to let it enable for this particular version. So let's try it again all the way from scratch. This time we're not going to reuse our preferences. We're going to delete those preferences because we're using 3.3 preferences for a version of Blender that came out in January of 2021. So with that folder deleted, we see that Blender opens up as if it's never seen us before. We're going to choose search, choose deep gray, you know me, and Shift H to hide everything. If we look at our folders, we see that 2.83 is a real folder. We don't see a little link icon on it. So this means that now we can actually test this on its own merits. So I'm just going to go with install, jump to C, and we are just going to folder zip. And first we'll install Boxcutter. That's the one giving the anxiety. And we see that it worked just fine. And then we go to HardOps and we install that and we enable it, and we see that it's also working fine. So if we press Alt W, we start Boxcutter, and because the preferences are unique to this version of Blender and aren't being migrated from another version previous, we're now able to get in and work. We're not having our top bar look all weird with all the icons being jumbled, because we're reusing preferences from a version of Blender that is yet to come from the future, basically, as far as this Blender is concerned. So with that, we can get in, begin cutting, and then of course with 2.83 you don't have any sort of options like your cutter being able to be exact or fast. That option isn't available. However, if we were to open a later version of Blender, like say 3.3.0, the version that we've been focused on, we see that we do have options for our solver showing up. So there are some differences with the older versions of Blender and configurations that make it where you can't go back very far with your configurations as far as migrations. Just something to keep in mind when it comes to using Blender.